Greetings of the day, everyone. I am Aislinn. Uh, I'm a member of Yongo, Akins, UNV, and I'm also the founder and CEO of ECB Sustainable Youth Foundation. I think we shall begin with the presentation that is on the regional MEAs administrated by UNEP and the Bamako Convention. Shall I go ahead?
Sure.
All right. Wonderful. Okay, the Bamako Convention was signed in 1991, and the signing place was Bamako, Mali. It was in force in 1998. There were 29 signatories and 25 parties, and the depository was Secretary General of AU, prohibits import of any hazardous and radioactive waste by parties. UNEP carries out secretariat function. Moving on to the historical context. Okay. Article 11, that's the Basel Convention, encourages regional conventions to manage harmful waste. The following factors also contribute to Bamako Convention's inception are lack of ban on trade of hazardous waste to LDCs under the Basel Convention, the realization that several industrialized countries were dumping harmful waste to Africa, and the cocoa incident of 1987. The Italian companies exported 18 barrels of harmful waste to the Nigerian farmers and paid them $100 for doing so. The key provisions are more robust than Basel Convention. Prohibition prohibits all imports of hazardous waste, abolishes exception for radioactive waste, prohibits the import of all hazardous and radioactive waste into Africa, minimizes and controls transboundary movements of hazardous waste within the Africa, prohibits ocean and inland water dumping of incineration of hazardous waste, while ensures environmentally sound waste disposal while establishing the precautionary principles, covers the national definitions of hazardous waste. Moving on to the successes and challenges. Starting with the successes. The successes involve approach to preventive pollution. As distinctive aspect of the Bamako Convention is the approach to preventive pollution. The convention does not allow for any substances to be released into the air which have potential to cause harm. This perspective is unique in that many other regulations allow toxic chemicals to be released in low amounts. Unlimited joint and several liability provision. Another unique feature of the Bamako Convention is the unlimited joint and several liability provision. When a country causes damage due to any violation of the convention, it can be penalized. Any monetary sanction that has a trier of fact determines. In the proceeding, it is not necessary to determine who was at fault for the accident that caused the loss, injury, or even the damage. Instead, the generator of was is strictly liable. It reached the international agreements while many other failed. That is, it brought countries together on an agreement which is tough for international agreements as countries do not come to consensus. Moving on to the challenges, lack of political will for the implementation of the convention. The adoption of the Bamako Convention was a clear demonstration that African states were completely dissatisfied with the protection accorded by the Basel Convention. However, the ratification of the convention has suffered from remarkable slowness, which is a major indicator of the absence of universal support and acceptance amongst African states themselves. As a result, the Bamako Convention only came to force in 1998. As of February 2010, it had been ratified by only 23 African countries. The economic realities of African states. In addition to the lack of political will for the implementation discussed, transboundary movement of hazardous waste across Africa remains undeterred because of the daunting economic realities faced by African states. The implementation of environmental law in Africa is partly and largely influenced by economic, technological, and political factors. For a continent where poverty and misery are never on a permanent vacation, and many are entangled in financial and economic difficulties. The, im- the importation of hazardous waste is rewarded by the promises of huge financial gains, which serve as a source of foreign revenue for these poor states. Statesmen have disclosed on public podium how such illegal trade would boost their national economies, making them completely oblivious to poisonous consensus and unplatable ramifications of such illegal transactions. Absence of waste management technologies. As a consequence of its chronic poverty, the relevant technologies for the treatment of hazardous waste is almost absent. The Bamako Convention prescribes strict measures regulating the transboundary movement of hazardous waste amongst the state party. Unfortunately, the convention does not contain any specific provisions on the development of the requisite waste management technologies that would, at least in theory, minimize such activity within the African continent. Inadequate international cooperation. The Bamako Conventions make no provision for the cooperation of its secretariat with the Basel Secretariat. It is self-evident that collaborative cooperation with Basel Convention, as well as other regional secretariats and intergovernmental, non-governmental organizations, is needed for the successful implementation of the aspirations of the Bamako Convention. Major cases of illegal dumping of hazardous waste in Africa after the adoption of Bamako Convention. In the 1970s, a big concern about the illegal transboundary movement of hazardous waste began to rise. This happened because it had been experienced a rise of the cases of illegal dumping of these wastes, mainly from wealthy nations to developing countries, a phenomenon that has been referred to as toxic colonization or non in my backyard. The purpose of this convention was and still is the reduction of the exports of hazardous waste in the case of Basel and a total ban of import of hazardous waste in the case of Bamako. It is therefore interesting to see to what extent these conventions have alleviated this program, and following the method of qualitative analysis, it can be observed if dumping the hazardous waste from developed countries to developing countries has still occurred in gross scale, like it had occurred in the period preceding the adoption of these instruments. This will be done with regard to Africa because the geographical area covered by the Bamako Convention is the African continent. To this aim, only the most well-known cases have been taken into account, like the Trafalgar case, which has obtained an enormous audience, and the Nigeria case. Less known cases regard the example of Somalia. It has been reported that after the tsunami of 2004 in the Indian Ocean, some containers with dumped waste, which were also nuclear, have been washed away to the Somali shore, causing some cases of deaths, diseases, and malformed babies due to the release into environment of substances like mercury and lead. Another case concerns England, where in 2014 a waste processor was sent to jail for 16 months by the UK court for exporting 46 tons of hazardous electrical waste illegally to Africa, mainly to Nigeria and Ghana. UNEP stresses the importance of this case because it was the first time where there had been a condemned to jail for illegal transboundary movement of hazardous waste. Moving on to the lessons learned. Safeguarding environmental health. The Bamako Convention underscores the need to protect human health and the environment from adverse effects of hazardous waste. It highlights the importance of responsible waste management practices to prevent pollution and negative health impacts. Regional cooperation. The convention emphasizes the significance of regional cooperation amongst African countries. It encourages nations to collaborate in managing hazardous waste movements, sharing information, and support each other's efforts to minimize environmental harm. Promoting sustainable development. Lessons from the Bamako Convention show that sustainable development and environment protection are interconnected. The responsible management of hazardous waste contributes to both the well being of the communities and the preservation of ecosystems. Legal frameworks and enforcements. Implementing the Bamako Convention highlights the necessity of robust legal frameworks and effective enforcement mechanisms. Adequate regulations, monitoring, and penalties are crucial to prevent illegal dumping and ensure compliance. International collaboration. While focused on Africa, the convention illustrates the value of international collaboration in addressing global environmental issues. It highlights the need for countries outside Africa to support the region's efforts in waste management and sustainable development. Moving on to the future goals and opportunities. Provisions for ensuring enforcement. There is a need for strong provisions to ensure enforcement of various undertakings. The Bamako Convention, with the exception of not giving waste amounts, has a relatively broad definition which does not allow parties to dispute the meaning of hazardous waste. Accordingly, a central issue is how much of a toxic chemical makes a waste hazardous. Whatever the answer is, it must be a uniform one. The only feasible manner to resolve this issue is to make trace of any a toxic chemical as hazardous waste. Otherwise the question would become how much of a chemical makes it hazardous. The answer to that question would invariably have to change depending on which waste was at issue. Workable and unambiguous definition of hazardous waste. A workable and unambiguous definition of hazardous waste must be achieved. The definition must eliminate the current inevitable confusion that exists. Capacity building. Future efforts will focus on building the capacity of African nations to manage hazardous waste more effectively. This includes providing training, technical assistance, and resources to improve waste management infrastructure and practices. Technology transfer. The Bamako Convention offers opportunity for technology transfer, allowing the African countries to access advanced waste management technologies from more developed regions. This can lead to improved waste treatment and recycling capabilities. Public awareness and education. Future opportunities lie in raising public awareness and educating communities about the hazards of improper waste disposal. Public participation and understanding are crucial for effective waste management and environmental protection. Monitoring and reporting. Enhanced monitoring and reporting mechanisms can help track the progress of hazardous waste management efforts across African countries. This data can inform decision making, identity challenges, and guide future interventions. Global partnerships. The Bamako Convention offers opportunities for global partnerships and collaboration. International organizations, governments, NGOs, and the private sector can work together to support African countries in achieving their waste management goals. Adaptation to emerging challenges. As new environmental and waste-related challenges arise, the Convention can adapt to address these issues. This adaptability ensures that the Convention remains relevant and effective in a changing world. Circular economy. The Convention can contribute to development of circular economy practices by encouraging recycling, reuse, and sustainable resource management. This can lead to reduced waste generation and greater resource efficiency.